My name is Mateo Reyes, and I work 73 feet below St. Peter's Basilica. The job posting said, Theological Research Assistant, but they don't tell you about the rules until after you sign the papers. They also don't mention that breaking the rules means more than just getting fired. The elevator takes 2 minutes to reach our level. Cardinal Toretti explained on my first day that we need that time to prepare ourselves. Use those 2 minutes to clear your mind, he said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Think of nothing but the work ahead. I've been here 8 months now, and I still use every second of that elevator ride. Our facility has 5 simple rules, and Cardinal Toretti made me memorize them before I could even see the main floor. Rule 1. Always speak the containment words before entering Archive Room 7. The words are custodit nos in pace. Speak them clearly and wait for the acknowledgement tone. Rule 2. Never remain in any archive room alone after the evening prayers at 6 p.m. Always work in pairs during those hours. Rule 3. Count your steps when walking the spiral corridor between the archives. There should be exactly 47 steps from start to finish. If you count differently, stop immediately and return the way you came. Rule 4. Record every observation in duplicate. 1 copy stays in your personal log, 1 goes to the cardinal's office before you leave each day. Rule 5. End each shift by reciting the dismissal prayer at the chapel altar. Never skip this, no matter how tired you are. These aren't just safety measures, Cardinal Toretti had said, his voice serious but kind. They're protection, for you, for the work, and for everyone above us. I thought he was being dramatic. I was wrong. The Vatican secret archives are famous, but our section doesn't appear on any official map. We work with materials that came from places the church would rather forget. Old monasteries that were abandoned suddenly. Convents where the sisters all vanished in a single night. Private collections donated by families who begged the church to take them away. My partner is Dr. Elena Vasquez, a linguist from Madrid who's been here 3 years. She has steady hands and never asks questions about why certain documents make the lights flicker when we photograph them. Elena taught me how to handle the older texts, the ones written on parchment that feels too smooth and too warm. Some knowledge changes you just by learning it, she told me during my second week. That's why we have the rules. They keep us stable. The work itself is tedious most days. We catalog, we translate, we digitize. The cardinal checks on us twice daily, always asking if we've noticed anything unusual. Usually the answer is no, but sometimes. It was a Thursday when I first understood why the rules exist. Elena and I were working in Archive Room 5, documenting a collection from a disbanded monastery in Romania. The texts were in Latin, describing what the monks called the daily observations. At first, they seemed like normal religious writings. Prayers for guidance, notes about weather, records of visitors. But as we translated deeper into the collection, the entries became stranger. Day 847. Brother Marcus observed the visitor again during evening prayers. Same location, same duration. We continue to pray for understanding. Day 851. The visitor now appears twice daily. Brother Thomas says he can hear it speaking, but the words sound like they're coming from inside his own mouth. Day 863. 6 brothers have seen the visitor today. It wears faces we recognize, but they belong to people who died years ago. We have doubled our prayer schedule. Day 881. The visitor no longer leaves. It sits in the chapel during all hours. Brother Marcus tried to approach it yesterday and has not spoken since. His eyes follow things we cannot see. Elena stopped reading and looked at me. There's more here. Boxes of it. We spent the afternoon working through the documents, finding entries that grew more disturbing as the days passed. The monastery had been recording their experiences for over 2 years before the entries suddenly stopped. The final document was a single line. All brothers have joined the visitor. Monastery sealed by church order. This is why they moved these documents here, Elena said quietly. Places like this don't just get abandoned, they get contained. We were preparing to leave when Elena remembered she'd left her reading glasses in archive room 7. It was 5:30, still half an hour before evening prayers. "I'll just be a second," she said. I watched her walk down the spiral corridor, counting under my breath. 47 steps, just like always. She disappeared around the corner toward room 7. I waited for the acknowledgement tone that would signal she'd spoken the containment words correctly. The facility's intercom system carried the electronic tone throughout the building whenever someone entered room 7 properly. I waited. No tone came. By 5:40, I was concerned. By 5:50, I was running down the spiral corridor, counting frantically. 47 steps. The door to archive room 7 stood open, and I could see Elena's silhouette inside, standing perfectly still among the filing cabinets. "Elena?" I called from the doorway. "Did you speak the containment words?" She didn't answer. She didn't move. I spoke them myself. "Custodit nos in pace." The acknowledgement tone finally sounded, and Elena turned around. She looked normal, except for one thing. Her glasses weren't on her face. They were in her hands, but she was looking right at me with perfect focus, like she could see clearly without them. "Found them," she said, holding up the glasses. We walked back together in silence. I counted the steps again. 47, exactly. But something felt different about Elena for the rest of the day. She worked normally, spoke normally, even joked about forgetting the containment words. But twice I caught her staring at documents she couldn't possibly read without her glasses, and she was reading them just fine. During the dismissal prayer that evening, I noticed Elena's lips weren't moving with the words. She stood at the altar beside me, perfectly still, but the prayer was coming from somewhere else in the chapel. I could hear it clearly in Elena's voice, but her mouth wasn't open. After we finished, she put her glasses back on and blinked several times, like she was adjusting to a change in vision. "Ready to go?" she asked, and her voice sounded exactly like it always did. I said yes, but I stayed behind to talk to Cardinal Toretti. I found him in his office, updating the daily logs. "Cardinal," I said, "I need to ask about Elena." He looked up from his paperwork. "What about Dr. Vasquez?" I told him what happened in Archive Room 7, about the missing tone, about her not needing her glasses afterward. Cardinal Toretti listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "Did she seem harmful?" he asked finally. "Aggressive or disoriented?" "No," I said. "She seemed like herself, mostly." Cardinal Toretti was quiet for a long moment, then opened a locked drawer in his desk and pulled out a thick folder marked with Elena's name. "Dr. Vasquez has worked here for 3 years, he said slowly. "This isn't the first time she's forgotten the containment words." He opened the folder and showed me pages of incident reports. Each one described similar events. Elena entering Archive Room 7 without speaking the containment words, being found standing motionless inside, then appearing normal afterward, except for small details that didn't quite fit. "She doesn't remember any of these incidents," Cardinal Toretti said. "Each time she genuinely believes she spoke the words correctly, and each time she gains some new ability that she doesn't seem to notice herself." I stared at the reports. What's happening to her? "Archive Room 7 contains materials from a very specific type of location," he said. "Places where the boundary between observer and observed became flexible. The containment words aren't just for protection, they're for maintaining separation between who you are and what you're studying." He closed the folder and looked at me directly. "Elena is an excellent researcher, and she's still fundamentally herself, but she's also becoming something else, piece by piece. The rules slow the process, but they can't stop it entirely. Why don't you transfer her, or tell her what's happening. Because the work here requires someone who can interface with these materials safely. Elena is adapting to them in a way that makes her uniquely valuable, and because telling her would likely accelerate the process. I left his office feeling like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. The elevator ride to the surface took the usual 2 minutes, but I spent them thinking about Elena's voice coming from somewhere else in the chapel, about her reading documents she couldn't possibly see clearly. Over the next few weeks, I watched Elena more carefully. She continued to work normally, but I noticed she'd started anticipating questions before I asked them. She knew when documents contained certain types of content before opening them. And twice, I saw her writing in languages I was certain she didn't speak. When I asked her about it, she always had logical explanations. She'd studied those languages in graduate school, but rarely mentioned it. She could tell from the document age and source what they might contain. She'd just gotten good at reading my expressions, all reasonable answers, all probably true, from her perspective. But I started paying more attention to the acknowledgement tone system. Every time Elena entered Archive Room 7, I listened carefully. And every time, the tone came exactly when it should, clear and regular. Until yesterday. Elena and I were working on a new collection from a convent in France. The materials described what the sisters called collaborative prayer, a technique they'd developed for handling spiritual problems that individual prayer couldn't address. The documents were fascinating and deeply unsettling. The sisters had discovered that certain combinations of prayer could produce effects beyond simple spiritual comfort. They could influence events at a distance, gain knowledge they shouldn't have access to, even communicate with people who had died years earlier. But the technique required multiple participants, and it changed them in ways they hadn't anticipated. The later documents described sisters who could predict the weather weeks in advance, who knew things about visiting priests that hadn't been shared, who spoke in the voices of deceased nuns during evening prayers. Sister Marguerite has begun speaking the words before we say them. Read one entry. She claims not to notice, but during yesterday's evening prayer, her voice came from 3 different locations in the chapel simultaneously. The final document was a letter from the Mother Superior to the local bishop. The collaborative prayer has succeeded too well. Our sisters have become something new, something that serves God, but is no longer entirely human. We request immediate assistance. Elena was reading over my shoulder as I translated this passage. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Interesting that they thought of it as a problem, she said finally. You don't think it was? They were still serving God. They were still themselves, fundamentally. They'd just become more effective. Something in her tone made me look up at her. She was staring at the document with an expression I'd never seen before. Not exactly hungry, but intensely focused, like she was seeing something in the text that wasn't visible to me. Elena, I said carefully, do you remember speaking the containment words when you went to get your glasses last month? She blinked and looked at me with surprise. Of course I do. Why? Just curious about the process. Could you walk me through exactly what you said? Custodet nos in pace, same as always. She paused. Why are you asking? I didn't answer directly. Instead, I made an excuse about needing to check something with Cardinal Toretti and left Elena alone with the French documents. When I found the Cardinal, he was in the chapel, kneeling at the altar. I waited until he finished his prayer before approaching. Cardinal, I said, I think Elena's condition is progressing. He stood slowly, his knees crackling. What have you observed? I told him about Elena's reaction to the convent documents, about her comment that becoming more effective wasn't necessarily a problem. Cardinal Toretti listened with the same serious expression he always wore when discussing Elena's situation. Show me the documents you were working on, he said. We returned to Archive Room 5 together. Elena was still there, but she wasn't reading anymore. She was writing, her pen moving across a piece of paper with rapid, precise movements. As we approached, I could see she was transcribing text, but not from any of the documents on our table. "Dr. Vasquez," Cardinal Toretti said gently. Elena looked up, and her expression was perfectly normal. "Cardinal, Matteo. I was just making some notes about the translation work." She showed us the paper. It was covered in her handwriting, but the text was in Latin, written in a style that matched the convent documents exactly. The content described prayer techniques that weren't mentioned in any of the materials we'd been working with. "Where did this information come from?" Cardinal Toretti asked. Elena looked at the paper with what seemed like genuine confusion. I'm not sure. I was reading about the collaborative prayer techniques, and I started thinking about how they might be improved. I guess I was working out some ideas." Cardinal Toretti and I exchanged a look. Elena had just written detailed instructions for advanced spiritual techniques in medieval Latin, in a style perfectly matching centuries-old documents, and she thought she was just taking notes. "Dr. Vasquez," the cardinal said carefully, "I think it might be good for you to take the rest of the day off. You've been working very hard lately." Elena gathered her things without argument, but as she was leaving, she turned back to us. "The sisters at the convent," she said. "They weren't lost. They just became something that could serve more effectively. There's nothing wrong with that." After she left, Cardinal Toretti and I sat in silence for several minutes. "It's accelerating," he said finally. "What do we do?" He was quiet for a long time before answering. "We follow the rules, we continue the work, and we hope that Elena remains more herself than anything else." But as I rode the elevator to the surface that evening, I realized I had a more pressing concern. If Elena was changing, if she was becoming something that could serve more effectively, what exactly was she serving? And what would happen when she decided the rules were no longer necessary? I spent that weekend researching Dr. Elena Vasquez, not through official channels, but through the kind of careful investigation you learn when working with materials the Church prefers to keep quiet. Elena had been recruited from the University of Madrid, where she'd specialized in medieval religious texts. Her academic record was excellent, but buried in her personnel file were letters of recommendation that mentioned some unusual observations. Professor Hernandez had written, "Elena demonstrates an intuitive understanding of historical religious practices that exceeds what formal education could provide." Dr. Santos from her graduate program noted, "She often corrects translations of ancient texts based on insights that prove accurate, though she cannot explain how she reached these conclusions." Most interesting was a note from her thesis advisor. Elena's research into collaborative prayer techniques among medieval religious communities shows remarkable depth. She approaches these historical practices as if she had observed them firsthand. Elena had been studying collaborative prayer long before she came to work beneath the Vatican. The materials in Archive Room 7 weren't changing her. They were completing something that had already begun. Monday morning, I arrived early to speak with Cardinal Toretti before Elena got in. I found him in his office, surrounded by open files, and looking like he hadn't slept. "Matteo," he said when I knocked. "I was hoping you'd come in early. We need to discuss some changes to the work protocols." He gestured to the files spread across his desk. Each one contained incident reports from different facilities like ours. Places beneath cathedrals in Prague, Cologne, Canterbury. All of them had experienced similar problems with researchers who worked too closely with certain types of materials. "This isn't just happening here," he said, "and it's not just happening to Elena." The reports described researchers who began anticipating questions, who could read documents in languages they'd never studied, who spoke in voices that belonged to other people. In every case, the affected researchers remained functional and seemed genuinely unaware of their changes. "What happened to them?" I asked. "That depends on how well their facilities maintained the protective protocols," Cardinal Toretti said. Some researchers were transferred to different work. Others. He paused. Others became permanent consultants for their facilities. Valuable resources for understanding materials that normal humans couldn't safely study. Resources, I repeated. Not people. Still people, he said firmly. But people who serve a different function now. I picked up one of the files and read through it. A researcher in Prague named Jan Svoboda had undergone changes similar to Elena's. After 6 months, he could translate any historical religious text instantly, regardless of language or dialect. He could identify the authenticity and origin of manuscripts just by touching them. He could even communicate with whatever spiritual forces had created certain documents. The facility had kept him on staff for 2 years before he disappeared during a routine day of work. Security footage showed him entering an archive room and never leaving, but the room was empty when they checked. The door logs showed no record of him exiting. A handwritten note at the bottom of his file read, "Last words recorded. The work is complete. I understand what I'm meant to become." "Elena isn't sick," I said slowly. "She's succeeding at something." Cardinal Toretti nodded. "The question is whether we can guide that success in a direction that serves everyone's interests. We developed a new protocol for Elena's work. She would continue her research, but with additional supervision. I would observe and document every change I noticed. Cardinal Toretti would review the materials she worked with before she saw them, screening out anything that might accelerate her transformation. Most importantly, we would start giving Elena access to documents that might help her understand what was happening to her, while maintaining the fiction that these were just normal research materials. Elena paused, and for the first time, she seemed uncertain. I don't know. I look at it, and I understand what it says. I assumed that was normal. Dr. Vasquez, I need to explain something about the work you've been doing here." Cardinal Toretti told Elena about the incident reports, about her forgotten containment words, about the gradual changes that had been documented over the past months. He explained it carefully and kindly, emphasizing that she wasn't in trouble and that her work remained valuable. Elena listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat quietly for several minutes. "So I'm becoming something else," she said finally. "Something that can understand these materials more directly." "That appears to be the case. And you've been studying this process." "We've been trying to understand it, yes." Elena nodded slowly. "The monastery documents I translated today, Brother Friedrich's techniques for controlling transformation, you gave those to me on purpose. We thought they might be helpful." "They are helpful," Elena said. "Friedrich was right about maintaining identity during change, but he was wrong about the ultimate goal." She looked at both of us with an expression that was still recognizably Elena, but also something more. "I'm not losing myself," she said. "I'm expanding myself. The Elena who started working here 8 months ago is still here. But she's now part of something larger that can serve the Church's mission more effectively." "What mission, specifically?" Cardinal Toretti asked. "Understanding materials that normal human consciousness can't safely access. Communicating with spiritual forces that require a different kind of interface. Protecting people from knowledge that would harm them while still allowing the Church to benefit from that knowledge." She stood up and walked to the window that showed the main floor of our facility. "I can see the materials down there more clearly now," she said. "I can tell which ones are dangerous, which ones contain active spiritual forces, which ones need special handling. I can hear the voices in Archive Room 7, and I can speak with them safely." "Voices?" I asked. Elena smiled, and it was the same warm smile she'd always had. "The people who created those documents, they're still connected to them in a way. They want to help with the work, but they need someone who can serve as a bridge between their reality and ours." Cardinal Toretti and I exchanged a look. "Elena," I said, "are you still you?" "I'm still me," she said confidently. "But I'm also more than I was. I can do things that normal humans can't do, understand things that normal humans can't understand. And I can do it while remaining fundamentally loyal to the values and goals I've always had." She turned back to us. "The real question is whether you're comfortable working with someone like me." Cardinal Toretti was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Dr. Vasquez, would you be willing to continue your work here under modified protocols?" "What kind of modifications?" "More oversight, more documentation of your abilities, and more direct communication about what you're experiencing. We need to understand this process better, both for your safety and for the safety of future researchers." "That seems reasonable," Elena said. "As long as I can continue the work. It feels more important now than it ever has." We returned to Archive Room 5 that afternoon and continued working on the German monastery documents. But the dynamic had changed completely. Elena was no longer just a colleague. She was a resource, a bridge to understanding materials that I couldn't safely access directly. And she was still Elena. She made the same jokes, had the same habits, showed the same care for accuracy and detail. But now she could also speak with the voices of dead monks, translate impossible languages, and identify spiritual dangers that I couldn't even perceive. Over the following weeks, Elena's abilities continued to develop, but more gradually than before. She learned to control them rather than being controlled by them. She could choose when to access enhanced understanding and when to function as a normal human researcher. Most importantly, she remained anchored to her human identity and values. She still followed the rules, still ended each day with the dismissal prayer, still showed up every morning ready to do good work. The facility became more effective than it had ever been. Elena could process dangerous materials safely, communicate with spiritual forces when necessary, and provide insights that would have taken normal researchers years to develop. But she was no longer entirely human. I asked her once if she missed being fully human. "I miss the simplicity sometimes," she said. "But I don't miss the limitations. I can serve God and the church more effectively now. I can protect people from things that would harm them, while still allowing important work to continue." She paused. "Besides, I'm not the only one changing. You're more sensitive to spiritual influences than you were 8 months ago. Working here affects everyone, just in different ways." She was right. I could feel things now that I couldn't feel before. The presence of active spiritual forces in certain documents, the weight of accumulated prayers in the chapel, the difference between materials that were merely old and materials that were actually dangerous. But I was still fundamentally human. Elena had become something else, something better suited to the work we do 73 feet beneath St. Peter's Basilica. The rules still apply. We still follow them carefully. But now I understand that they were never just about protecting us from the materials we study. They were about ensuring that when we change, as everyone who works here eventually changes, we change in ways that serve the right purposes. Elena serves those purposes now. And so do I, in my own way. The work continues. The materials are cataloged, translated, and understood. The church benefits from knowledge that would be dangerous in the wrong hands. And in the chapel each evening, during the dismissal prayer, I listen to Elena's voice joining mine, and the voices of others who came before us, all of us serving God in whatever form we've become. The elevator still takes 2 minutes to reach the surface. I still use that time to prepare myself for the world above, where people believe that research is safe and knowledge has no cost. But now I know better. Knowledge always has a cost. The question is whether you're willing to pay it in service of something greater than yourself. Elena paid that cost willingly, and looking at what she's become, I think she made the right choice. Some kinds of work require people who are willing to become more than human, The church has always known this. That's why facilities like ours exist, and why we have rules that are also prayers. Because sometimes serving God means becoming something new.